Muito bem. Boa tarde a todas e todos. É um prazer enorme recebê-los mais uma vez para o nosso programa de seminários do DCP USP. Aqueles que nos acompanham também à distância pelo YouTube, sejam bem-vindos. Hoje nós temos o grande prazer, a grande honra, satisfação mesmo de receber o professor Antony Pereira, que já pode ser considerado da casa, mas merece, sobretudo em função, Antony, dos estudantes mais novos, uma apresentação, mesmo que breve, da sua trajetória, para que eles tenham mais informação e conhecimento sobre a importância de quem a gente está recebendo aqui hoje. Então, peço licença sua para falar um pouco do seu caminho pela academia e fora dela. Então, o professor Antony Pereira é mestre e doutor em Government pela Harvard University, na área de política comparada, com ênfase em América Latina. E, por essa via, ele se tornou assim, um grande conhecedor da política de países da América Latina e do Brasil em especial. Foi por esse caminho que ele produziu e publicou uma das mais originais, finas, e eu acrescentaria por minha conta, sensíveis, análises e interpretações acerca do regime autoritário brasileiro. E eu uso esses qualificativos especialmente para me referir à maneira como o professor Antony examinou o recurso, a combinação de legalidade com violência num regime que buscou a famosa institucionalização, embora nunca tenha tido êxito nesse sentido. E o professor Antony foi o autor que conseguiu captar essa combinação com mais fineza, com mais sensibilidade e acerto, se você me permite. Nesse sentido, é autor de livros e inúmeros artigos, boa parte deles relativos ao Brasil. Ao lado da sua carreira acadêmica, solo, o professor Antony Pereira tem o hábito de andar por aí construindo instituições ou ajudando outros a construírem instituições. É um peregrino das instituições, eu ousaria dizer. Então, ele fundou e dirigiu por um longo tempo o Brazil Institute no King's College, London, né? Que recebeu muitos de nós e teve uma parceria, ainda segue tendo uma parceria muito grande com as instituições brasileiras. Ele criou o mestrado e o doutorado no Instituto Brasil, do King's College, né? Liderou inúmeras iniciativas de cooperação desse instituto com instituições brasileiras, inclusive a USP, especialmente com o nosso Instituto de Relações Internacionais, onde ele também foi professor visitante entre 2017 e 2019. Então, eu tomaria muito tempo citando todos os exemplos que demonstram como o professor Antony Pereira ajudou a construir instituições por onde passou, tornando-se um verdadeiro hub de interações pessoais e institucionais no interior de uma grande rede da qual a gente tem o privilégio e o prazer de fazer parte, né? Então, para nós, ele é um brasilianista, muito querido, muito respeitado pela sua obra, por suas análises, mas especialmente também pelo tempo de vida dedicado a nos apoiar em diversas iniciativas de construção institucional. Na passagem recente de 2022 para 2023, o professor Antony se transferiu para a Flórida. Então, ele está hoje na Florida International University, onde ele dirige o Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center. Isto? Muito bem. Certo. Então, esse seminário, também devo registrar, não teria sido possível, assim como outros tantos que temos realizado, sem o apoio da professora Janina Onuki, a quem eu agradeço especialmente por este e pelos outros tantos, dos quais você tem sido tão importante na organização, Janina, e institucionalmente ao KN, né, que é colaborador direto do seminário de hoje, o Centro de Estudos das Negociações Internacionais. Muito obrigado também, em nome do DCP e de toda a audiência, que agradece a colaboração de vocês no patrocínio da vinda do Antony aqui hoje. Então, muito obrigado. E você tem a palavra, que, aliás, será exercida em inglês, né? Tínhamos combinado isso, então o Antony vai fazer a palestra em inglês, mas depois debate, perguntas e respostas, o português, assim como o inglês, são igualmente confortáveis para o professor Antony. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Rogério. Espero que possa fazer uma apresentação interessante, suficientemente para merecer essa apresentação. E eu fui pedido para apresentar em inglês, então eu vou fazer em inglês. Mas se queremos, estou completamente aberto a receber comentários e perguntas em português depois. So I've come today to talk about an edited volume that I've been working on, and I swore, I did an edited volume in the 1990s, and after that experience I swore I would never do another one. And somehow I got talked into doing another one. And I want to talk about it because I think it's about something important, and I hope that it's a contribution to the field. It's a book that started out as a project about populism and became a project on right-wing populism, just by chance, because that's what most of the papers were about. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the project and some of the arguments in this book. This photo actually was taken on Avenida Paulista in 2019. I was a visitor at USP, and I had the great experience of being a visitor at USP and actually getting legal permission to work in Brazil, which was an incredible experience. It was very, very complicated. I made many trips to the Superintendencia, the Polícia Federal. I was kind of like their old friend up there. And it was only with the help of people at USP that I managed to get that permission, right? And the irony was when I finally got the card, with the legal right to work in Brazil, it had like 2 months before it expired. So it was a great deal of work for a very short period of time when I could legally work in Brazil. But I took this picture on Avenida Paulista on the 26th of May, 2019. And before that, on the 19th of May, I actually ran into Rogério on Avenida Paulista at the protest against the Bolsonaro government because of the cuts to the education budget. And I remember Rogério telling me very prophetically, when a government like this starts messing with higher education, public higher education, it's going to run into trouble. This is going to produce a backlash. And I thought about Rogério when the election results happened in October of 2022. So this wasn't really a project about Bolsonaro. It didn't start that way. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the project, which I hope is of interest to you. I'll try not to go into too many details. Talk about just selected arguments in the book to give you a flavor of the book. It's going to be out in June. And then just at the end, talk about what I think right-wing authoritarianism is. And I know the conventional way in social science would be to start with the definition, a clear definition, and then go through the arguments to explain how it happened, what its effects are, how it can be counteracted. I'm not going to do it that way, because although my training tells me that that's the proper way to do things, I'm not going to do it that way because the project didn't work that way. It started with a conference where I was encouraged at King's to put together a group called the Authoritarianism and Populism Working Group, because we found out in the School of Global Affairs at King's that lots of people were working on these things but not talking to each other. And so we had a group that was concentrating on Russia. We had a group that was concentrating on Brazil. We had a group that was concentrating on India. And we had a small group even that was of brave people that were working on China, although they weren't many in that institute. And the Russians said, this can't be a research group on populism only, because we had populism a while ago, and now we have full-blown authoritarianism. So we got to have that in the title. So we formed an interdisciplinary research group. We did a lot of bibliographical research on what was being written about for those three countries. But then someone said to me, it was actually Linda Newson at the Institute for Latin American Studies at the University of London. She said, why don't you do a conference on populism? There's an explosion of work on populism. And Latin America has been traditionally associated with populism. Have a call for papers. So we had a call for papers, a very open call. It didn't define populism in any particular way. It just said we wanted to do it online. It was in the middle of the pandemic, so it was all online. But we got a tremendous number of proposals, and it was a task to winnow them down. And it turns out that there were a lot of people in Brazil who knew about the Institute, who submitted their proposals, and many of them were people who'd never written on populism before. but they were driven to do so because they were living in Brazil during a pandemic with a right-wing populist government in charge, and they were going crazy, right? They were sitting at home going crazy. So we got all these proposals, and we made a selection, and we ended up with, it was a suggestion of a student helping us, a guy from UFSCar, who said, you've really got theory, political economy, institutions, and then a whole section on COVID-19. And Linda Newson, the person who encouraged me to do the conference, and the conference was very enlightening. We really enjoyed a lot of the presentations. We had a keynote at the end by Stephen Levitsky from Harvard, talking about how the demand side of populism was not being filtered. You know, the supply side was increasing because the traditional gatekeepers were disappearing in a lot of these democracies. And Linda talked me into doing a book proposal. Why don't you do a book now based on the papers? Do a selection of the papers. And the risk of failing in this kind of initiative, I think, are very high. And I hope that I haven't failed. Partly because there's so much flux and indefinition and debate about even what populism is. And this is why I think Ernesto Laclau's book on populist reason has such an enduring value, not because I'm a Laclauian. I don't share his definition of populism. I think seeing it psychoanalytically as a logic doesn't work for comparative politics in my sense. But the book is very persuasive in showing how, amongst various authors, their usage is extremely inconsistent. And there is no there in many studies of populism. So the risk of failure is high. And I think Ruth Behrens Collier, who I read her work, the Collier and Collier book, Shaping the Political Arena, which is a classic study of mid-20th century Latin American populism. I don't think I ever convinced her that this project was worthwhile. Even her blurb is on the book. Well, I don't know if it's on the book. It's in the catalog at Routledge. But I think she felt that that this kind of project was difficult to pull off. And when I finally finished this thing, because I convinced myself that I didn't want to do another edited volume ever again after finishing this one, but I patted myself on the back. I said, I've done something relevant. You know, this is one of the political challenges of our time, is dealing with right-wing populism. I've made a contribution. And I said, just out of curiosity, I want to see how many other books on populism Routledge has published, you know, just to see what kind of impact this work might have. 638 books with populism in the title by Routledge alone. We're not talking about the entire universe of academic publishing. We're talking about one publishing company. Okay, it's a big company. And I thought, this is going to be a tiny little pebble dropped in an ocean, right? This is all I'm doing. So hopefully I can get some of you to have a look at it. Now, this is an interesting book because there's 22 different scholars who've contributed to it. We cover 29 different countries in the book. We look at Europe. We look at 16 countries in Europe, USA, Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, Uribe in Colombia, Fujimori in Peru. But of course, the grand star of this book, not my intention, I didn't set out to do it this way, is Bolsonaro in Brazil. So the entire last section of the book, so you sort of seduced, start reading and it looks very general and lots of cases. And then by the time you get to the end of the book, the last section on COVID-19, it's one chapter after another about Bolsonaro dealing with COVID-19. All 4 chapters in that section are about Brazil. And I think that's maybe one of its most original contributions, that it's a collection of empirically grounded studies from different perspectives, using different approaches, showing the devastating consequences in a public health emergency of having a government with this kind of mindset, with this kind of right-wing populism approach. I hope it'll be found useful for other things. Of the contributors, 6 of the contributors are Brazilians who are based outside Brazil. 9 of them are Brazilians in Brazil. 2 are non-Brazilians in Brazil, and the rest are other, right? But there's a very strong Brazilian contribution here. And it wasn't my intention, but because the Institute was the one making the call for papers and our networks were used to spread that, it became very much a book about Brazil. And my role is modest, so what I'm going to say today is partly based on the work of other people. I'm going to feature the 3 chapters that I think are particularly interesting. And my role, I felt very self-conscious about my role as editor, because what I did was I contributed an introduction and a conclusion based on the work of all these other people that had presented at the conference that I didn't present at the conference, right? I was just the organizer. And I was very self-conscious that the conclusions that I drew from the papers were not necessarily conclusions that everybody who contributes to the book shares. And so I may get some feedback when this finally comes out that, why did you say this about my work? You completely mischaracterized it. I don't agree with the conclusions you draw. Well, we could have another conference, right? And I think, my own experience with populism was somewhat indirect in that I was a graduate student in comparative politics in the 1980s, and so part of my curriculum was to learn about the mid-20th century populist leaders in Latin America. That's why the Collier and Collier book, Shaping the Political Arena, was so important to me, because I learned from that enormous project that, in a way, this is a Latin American contribution to world politics. People like Getúlio Vargas, Juan Domingo Perón, Velasco Ibarra, incorporated the urban working class and the middle class. They kind of superseded a very oligarchic elitist system, and they sort of absorbed these new political forces and created something distinctive that blended elements of left and right, that was an alternative to liberal elitist systems, that was an alternative to communism, an alternative to fascism, something distinctive. And I thought that that's all populism was. It was just something I studied as a historical remnant. It wasn't anything contemporary. I did start to follow, though, in the 90s, the debates about the so-called neoliberal populists, right? Collor de Mello, Fujimori, Menem in Argentina. Ruth Collier has an interesting critique of this work, but she never accepted them as real populists. But what reawakened my interest in the topic was in 2012, I was invited by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, kind of the Christian Democratic Foundation in Germany, who have been obsessed about populism actually long before the current explosion of work on populism, right? Way before 2016 when you had Brexit and Trump. And they invited me to Brussels to give a paper on, is Lula a populist? Right? That was the question. Is Lula a populist? And I thought, I think I can answer that question. I think I could have a go at that. And so I went, and very persuasively, Rovira Kaltwasser, the Chilean-German scholar, was there, and he gave this ideological definition of populism. Right? Populism is an ideology that divides elites from the people, the true people, and it considers the people pure, and it wants to create a general will of the people represented by the populist leader. And I thought, well, that kind of makes sense. I think I can work with that. And let me just do a kind of basic paper where I just look at some of the rhetoric that Lula has used as president. What does he say about who the people are? Who does he represent? Who are the people? And it wasn't highly scientific, my paper. I went through some speeches, and I concluded that Lula was not a populist, that what he was doing was affirming the dignity of working class people. He was valuing them. He was giving them means for social mobility. But he wasn't demonizing the elite. He wasn't saying that the elite were not the people. He was not saying that the people who were rich and making money under his presidency didn't deserve to be rich and making money. He was simply trying to provide a social safety net to bring up people. And this was a conclusion that I knew not everyone shared. I knew that Leslie Bethel, for example, thought that Lula was a populist. And I knew that other people called Lula a sub-Peron, they called Petismo or Lulismo, more accurately, sub-Peronism. But I reached this conclusion, and I submitted it in all sincerity, hoping that Konrad Adenauer would publish this paper as part of an edited volume. And they had a falling out. The editors argued about something. I think they disagreed about basic definitions, and the book was never published. It was listed in Amazon for years as forthcoming. And I kept checking, obsessively checking Amazon. Where the hell is this book? Damn it, I did all this work. I presented this paper, and it never came out. In a way, I'm kind of glad now it never came out because I don't have that I don't use that definition anymore. The Rovira Kaltwasser. I'm not. The more I read about populism, the more I was convinced it wasn't an ideology. It's a style. It's a performative style. And so maybe it's okay. Maybe I got lucky, right? But it did whet my appetite. And so when Linda Newson said you could do something on populism, I said, yeah, I could. I kind of know something about it, right? Let's do it. So I hope I haven't given you too many details about how this. I know that's sometimes boring to know how something was made, right? Making of. But I wanted to give you that because I wanted you to know how I came at this. And what I tried to do in structuring the book, I said, well, you've got at least 3 or 4 really interesting questions here. How do we define right-wing populism? And it became right-wing populism because we had so little on left-wing populism. The contributors to the conference, we only had 1 paper on Kirchnerismo. But how do we define right-wing populism? And as I say, I'll try to get to that at the end. What accounts for its rise? Because I agree with Finkelstein that this is the movement of the moment. This is the one. This is resonating around the world. What does it do in power? And what are the best ways to counteract it? I'm very aware. I try to be analytical, and I think we're all, as social scientists, have to, study dispassionately the objects of our analysis. But we're also citizens, and so we get freaked out, right, by when things like right-wing populism happens. But we have to try to handle that tension. And I think in any existing form of populism, right-wing or not right-wing, we need to look at who are the people. This is what I was trying to do when I was looking at Lula's speeches. Because juridically, the people in a democracy are defined legally, right? Who are citizens? What rights do they have? But of course, politically, in terms of movements and parties and governments and leaders, they're defined in many other ways. And when we look at who the people are in populist discourse, we need to pay attention to who's excluded, who is not the people. And so you have some tropes in Bolsonarismo, for example, in which the entire left seems to be not the people, right? Or activists are not the people. Or in certain forms of Trumpism in the United States, it's clear that non-white people are not the people, right? And despite what Steve Bannon says, Steve Bannon says, I'm a civic nationalist. I want to defend the citizens of my nation against globalism. Well, if you look at Breitbart, the publication that he promoted, it's full of non-civic nationalism. It's full of ethnic nationalism, right? Where race is a factor in who the people are. And so I think these are really important questions. And what's difficult, I think, for us as social scientists is that we want to enrich our knowledge by classifying types of populism. Kind of a way a butterfly collector would pin butterflies to the wall and say, Bolsonarismo is different from Trumpism in these respects. Populism in India is different from populism in Europe because of, the other is different. The other is not an immigrant. The other is an Islamic person who's native to India. At the same time, with the speed of light that social media has, populist movements are changing, right? They've got trajectories that are distinctive. So while we pin the butterfly to the wall, the butterfly is changing. So we have this dual role of trying to understand trajectories and understand classifications. And I think it's very difficult. So I respect anyone who's contributed to this literature because I think it's not easy. I hope that makes sense, and I'm not going on too long. I'm gonna have to accelerate because I guess I'm tired. I'm sort of discursively, I'm becoming like Jello. Okay, so let me give you a flavor of 3 chapters, and I'm not saying that these are the best chapters or these are the only things you should read if you get the book, but let me give you a flavor of 3 chapters that I think are really interesting and that sort of have a great dialogue with each other. And the first is by Diogo Ferrari, a Brazilian social scientist based in California, who looks at the European Social Survey and voting data and says, what is it that leads people in Europe to vote for right-wing populist parties that are anti-immigrant, right? So what he says, I think, is very interesting. He says that economic hardship is important. It's a relevant variable. So households with low income have a tendency to but it's not just low income. It's not just people who've had economic hardship. It's when that's associated with psychological factors that are picked up in the ESS that they have dissatisfaction, resentment, perception of threat, and anti-immigrant sentiment. So when you combine those things, that's correlated with voting for right-wing populist parties. He's very it's the most quantitative chapter in the book. And he's very careful not to claim causal arguments. He said, look, I'm just comparing voting patterns with the European Social Survey. I'm not saying that this causes anything, but there's a correlation. He says low-income voters vote for right-wing populist candidates, but that is mediated by resentment of political elites and anti-immigration attitudes, perceptions that they are a threat. And he says here, and I think this is very interesting the way he says this, he tries to be very careful in his argument. He says it's important that nothing in the argument I presented here allows us to conclude that only the low-income are anti-immigrant and right-wing populist supporters. The only thing we can conclude is that preliminary evidence supports the argument that household economic conditions help to explain right-wing populist support, in part because it affects the attitudinal dimensions, in particular, resentment of the status quo, dissatisfaction with the economy and political parties, and perceptions that immigrants represent an economic and cultural threat. Nothing in the argument says that affluent populations do not have those attitudes as well. It only says that economic hardship can trigger those attitudes. So he's inviting us to understand that connection better. And then if you go to another chapter in the book, that's a study of 16 European countries. If you go to Cecilia Lero's chapter, which is called Voting for Violence, she compares support for Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil. And it's an interesting comparison, and I'm surprised it hasn't been done more, because Duterte's language is in many ways similar to Trump about, eliminating criminals and the need to be tough on crime. And what she comes up with is a very interesting argument about the so-called new middle class in both Philippines and Brazil. And she argues that the new middle class has defines itself in terms of its consumption. It has enough disposable income to purchase valuable consumer goods, but it's economically insecure and therefore is particularly vulnerable to crime. A lot of the families in the new middle class are paying income tax for the first time, and they're particularly sensitive to corruption, to government corruption and government incompetence. And they have the ability to travel abroad, and they often go to countries that they perceive as more orderly and more efficient than their own countries. And they feel excluded from governments that have social policies for the poor and that benefit the wealthy, and they feel squeezed that they're in the middle, that they're not getting anything out of these governments. And so people with radical arguments about unleashing violence on criminals and the corrupt, those arguments resonate with them. And she makes a distinction, and she says, this isn't the same as European right-wing populism, because these are countries that are net the net outward migration. So migrants are not necessarily the target here. The other, the not the people, are not necessarily immigrants with a different religion, different skin color, but they're native to the country. They're criminals or they're corrupt. And Cecilia says that, and again, she tries to moderate her argument. She's not making a totally comprehensive causal argument. She says the emergence of the new middle class is not the most important factor contributing to the elections of Duterte and Bolsonaro, but it is important and interesting. One driver of right-wing populism is a new middle class with particular fears and frustrations that make it vulnerable to violent anti-system politics. And she makes an interesting observation at the end of the chapter. She said the left often takes a defensive position when it's faced with right-wing populist rhetoric. It speaks of piecemeal reforms, but it sounds as if, to some voters, as if it's defending the status quo. She says this message of the left does not speak to the new middle class who see themselves on the front lines of an immediate war marked by insecurity and danger, and thus drastic and violent rhetoric that promises to break the system is more directly relatable to them and more appealing. So, this is why sometimes right-wing authoritarians sound like they're about to have a nervous breakdown, right? This is the apocalypse. We have to do something radical. And I think her work is in dialogue with the work on European right-wing authoritarianism, because she's saying these are not the losers of globalization, as is sometimes summarized to explain support for right-wing populism in Europe. The new middle class are people who have benefited in some ways from economic globalization, but they feel insecure, right? And they feel that their position is, their newfound status is threatened. And this is corroborated by the final chapter I want to talk about by Leo Avritzer and Lucio Reno. And these, by the way, these are the only two people who weren't in the conference. They contributed afterwards. But they argue that perceptions of downward mobility are positively correlated with votes for Bolsonaro in 2018. And they argue that the populism right-wing populism in its Brazilian form works at both the elite and the mass level. At the elite level, it denies the importance of mediating institutions, such as parties, such as the media, such as institutions of accountability. And on the mass level, it wants to concentrate power in the body of the leader, the populist leader. And they said that Brazil the gatekeepers in Brazil were never particularly strong, but gatekeepers were eroded with the reduction in the trust in the political system that you see in the 2010s. And they call right-wing populism in Brazil a form of anti-politics, in which there's a high faith in the military, the armed forces, there's a faith in violence, there's an authoritarian tendency. And perhaps the most persuasive graph in the book is the graph in this chapter by Lucio Reno and Leo Avritzer, where they chart they show the evolution of the deaths from COVID-19 and the disapproval of the Bolsonaro government. So in early 2020, 33% of the survey respondents said that the government was bad or awful, but 43% said it was excellent or good. By the end of 2021, that had flipped. So you had 53% of the people saying that it was bad or awful, and only 22% saying it was excellent or good. And of course, this was a time of lots of deaths from COVID-19. So you're looking at a government that 9 or 10 months away from the election has got 53% of the population saying it's bad or awful. And it didn't survive that. It almost did survive that, but it didn't. So I hope that gives you a flavor of some of the arguments in the book. And I wanted to just then try to get into this issue of the definition. I know I've been doing this backwards. I've been talking about right-wing populism as if we all know what it is, and we all agree on its definition. But let me try to go backwards and get to that point. So in many ways, the index of the book for me, which is usually just a thing you do at the end, out of sheer bureaucratic obligation to the press, the index for me was a revelation, because I got the following terms in the index. I exploited my daughter. I made her do the index for me. I paid her, though. So you get at the beginning of the index: anti-communism, anti-diversity, anti-cosmopolitan, anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-globalist, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-pluralism, anti-politics, anti-science. It's a lot of antis, right? So, one or two of these we might have to leave out for any particular brand of right-wing populism we know, but a lot of them share a lot of those characteristics. And so, as I said, what I came to the conclusion of reading these papers, conducting this process, is that right-wing populism are movements, parties, governments, leaders who engage in transgressive political performances that oppose elites in the name of the people. They rely, at least in part, on unmediated communication between leaders and followers. That's the populism part. That's what all populisms share. And that's coupled with a host ideology that is anti-globalist. It emphasizes traditional social values, ethnic or religious nationalism. And so I think with that kind of definition, you do have, it's a category that's not, that allows for alternatives, right? It allows for populism that isn't right-wing. It allows for non-populist forms of politics, such as class politics, such as technocratic politics. And I think what you can sort of do, you can think of it sequentially as the populist part, I would say, consists of at least 5 elements. And this is, most populisms share this. And the first one, I would say, it's Gnostic in terms of the production of knowledge. This isn't shared by a lot of the literature, but I would add this. And the idea here in populism is that conventional sources of information and knowledge are unreliable. They're distorting. You cannot trust the conventional media, the conventional academia, science, universities, governments. You need to decode reality. What appears to be reality is not reality. This is why social media is so important. You need a kind of Gnostic source of real information. The second one is, and I guess this is going to sound repetitive because I've already really said this, but only part of the people are the authentic people. The elites must be rejected, rhetorically at least, maybe not in practice. The people are not a complex, heterogeneous collectivity that has to be represented pluralistically. The people are a unity. The people are one thing. And that one thing has to be represented by a charismatic leader. And I say charismatic not in a full-blown sense. I mean in the kind of very narrow Weberian sense of someone who is considered to be divinely graced in some way, right? To have special attributes. Usually a man, but we have Giorgia Meloni, we have Marine Le Pen. So we do have leaders who are not men, but it's usually a man. And then finally, politics is an existential war between friends and against enemies. So Carl Schmitt, the German theorist, is very relevant to this. Your political rivals are not people who you respect, whom you defer to, whom you accept losses to, right? This is why it was news in the United States when a Democrat candidate conceded an election, right? It became front page news. This guy said that his opponent won the election. Huge deal because, of course, Trump didn't. So this idea of politics, so I would say those are elements that all populisms have. And then you come to the right-wing part of it. There's a great quote from Michael Lind, a think tank specialist who wrote a book on populism in the United States, where he says, take back control from the forces of technocratic elitism. I think left and right-wing populism share that. And I think it's important, and I try to follow Ruth Collier here, to see populism as a subtype of mass politics. And on the right-wing side, it frames politics as a moral crusade. It has an aversion to globalism and multilateralism, defends national sovereignty. And as Finkelstein says, it is dominant in the present. I hope I guess we can debate whether that's a suitable definition for all of the kinds of variation we're seeing with right-wing populism. But let me end by talking about something that isn't in the book, but that I'm very concerned about now, living in Florida. And that is, when does right-wing authoritarianism threaten democracy, right? Because I think this is the key question. If it's just an exotic form of politics that is weird and that we don't, a lot of us don't really like, it's not a big deal, right? It's just a subjective orientation that we might have. But I think it does, in many instances, threaten democracy, especially when a right-wing authoritarian leader is re-elected. Okay? That's why I think the 2022 election was so important in Brazil, that Bolsonaro couldn't manage to get re-elected. I happen to live in a state where a right-wing authoritarian leader got re-elected last November, right? And I was very disappointed. The candidate that I voted for in my congressional election was a Democrat who accused the Republican of being a communist, and the Republican accused the Democrat of being a communist, and I thought, I don't really have a candidate here. I'm screwed. But I would say that DeSantismo, or the sort of position of DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is an outgrowth of Trumpism, is a more dangerous form of Trumpism than Trump himself, because he managed to win an election. He manages to control a state legislature that's basically a one-party legislature. And he's replicating in many ways what Viktor Orban has been able to do in Hungary with the Civic Alliance government. He's being able to wage a cultural war with the full backing of his legislature in a way that is very, very threatening to other institutions and to many rights. And so DeSantis likes to say, Florida is where woke goes to die. Okay? That's his slogan. A lot of people looking at the demographics of Florida, it's got the highest percentage of people in the U.S. over the age of 65, and they say Florida is where old people go to die, right? It's not where woke goes to die. But with this kind of slogan, what he's doing is passing a series of measures that are restricting what can be taught in primary and secondary schools, and now, with a new bill that's just passed, in universities. And I want to give you a sense of the gravity that we in the university system in Florida feel in a state run by a right-wing authoritarian, because there are passages in this bill. It hasn't been signed into law yet. So I'm going to be able to legally say things now that I probably won't be able to legally say next week. So I'm going to take maximum advantage and say them. Here's part of the legislation. And I haven't been able to see the final version of this bill because it's just been passed. It's just been, they've had a reconciliation between the House and the Senate version, and DeSantis hasn't signed it yet, but he will sign it. But it says, the draft of the bill says this: a Florida college system institution may not expend any state or federal funds to promote, support, or maintain any programs or campus activities that advocate for diversity, equity, or inclusion, promote or engage in political or social activism, or include or espouse preferential treatment or special benefits to individuals on the basis of sex, disability, or religion. Let me just take advantage of the fact this is legal. I'm going to say that I think my center, LAC, should promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay? It's on record. Still legal. And this is the problem, I think, with right-wing authoritarianism. It creates this hysteria. And it creates this kind of McCarthyite sense that you have to stop certain freedoms from being exercised. Otherwise, the fabric of society is going to be threatened. And I think one of the great examples of this kind of mentality is, I don't know if you've seen this, Giorgia Meloni's speech in June of 2022 when she went to Marbella, Spain for a Vox rally. And she gave a speech where she said, yes, right? She had a bunch of yeses and a bunch of no's. Yes to the natural, what she called the natural family. No to the LGBT lobby. Yes to sexual identity. No to gender ideology. Yes to the culture of life. No to the abyss of death. I don't want to go through all this because I'm going to start sounding like a right-wing populist, right? But what it's doing is creating this fear and this anxiety by demanding a series of yes-no decisions. So if you think that people of any gender and sexual orientation should be able to love someone else, you're destroying the heterosexual patriarchal family. If you think that migrants have rights, you're destroying the borders of the country and the coherence of the national sovereignty of your country. If you think that there should be separation of church and state and a secular, pluralistic approach to religion, you're threatening Christianity, right? Or you're in favor of Muslim terrorism. This is the logic of McCarthyism, right? This is the exaggeration that you have to choose between these dichotomous variables as if there's no capacity to reconcile these. And let me read you another passage from this terrible law. And this is really funny, I think, for those of us in universities. How am I doing for time, Rogero? Great, okay. Almost done. So we as people in the universities, just get a load of this language. The legislature finds it necessary that every undergraduate student of a public post-secondary educational institution in the state of Florida graduates as an informed citizen through participation in rigorous general education courses that study and articulate the values and knowledge necessary to preserve the constitutional republic and the economic ingenuity of its citizens through proven, historically accurate, and high-quality coursework. Courses with curriculum that is based on unproven, disproven, speculative, or exploratory content are best suited to fulfill elective or specific program prerequisite credit requirements rather than general education requirements. Think about what they're saying. They're saying there's some body of knowledge which is proven, which is accurate, and then there's some other knowledge which is speculative, it's basically wrong. You can teach it at the margins, but it can't be the main thing that most people are assigned. This is a pre-enlightenment understanding of what knowledge is. There's a dogma. There's a catechism that has to be taught, and then there's the other stuff that you can tolerate at the margins, but it's not going to enter the mainstream. It's anti-humanist, it's anti-enlightenment. It's a violation of the First Amendment. I think Stan Gasek, my friend who's a lawyer, that was his first reaction to seeing the draft of this bill. It's unconstitutional. It's going to be struck down. As another bill that was similar to this one has already been struck down in the federal courts. So I want to say, I guess I want to end by saying, I know I've gone off topic here. I'm a long way from this book, but it is related. Florida is going to become the state where DeSantism goes to die, because I believe that the universities are going to prevail, they're going to resist, there's going to be judicial challenges to this kind of law. It's not going to seriously affect what goes on in the universities, but it does make us feel that we're on the front lines of a right-wing authoritarian assault. And this kind of thing is what exactly led the Central European University in Hungary to move to Austria, because they felt that they couldn't continue to operate. Now, we don't have that luxury. We can't move FIU to Georgia. Maybe if they'd take us, maybe we could go. University in exile, right? The New School was founded because people left Columbia because they were being told they couldn't criticize U.S. participation in World War I. But I do want to end on an optimistic note, because I think if we, and here's where I think the analytical task of studying right-wing authoritarianism and the political task of trying to create alternatives to it by engaging in the public sphere and not just engaging in academic work, they come together. Because I think through argument, through analysis, through debate, we can show the absurdity of some of this performative language, this approach to knowledge, this approach to culture, this approach to democracy, and show it up for what it is. So I'm sorry for going on so long, but I promise you I've now ended. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Anthony, por nos apresentar o livro e, em detalhe, alguns dos seus capítulos. Só faltou dizer quando ele vai estar disponível para a gente.
Sim,
junho?
Sim, sai em junho.
Yeah. Ótimo. Tá, perfeito. Muito bem. Então, agora podemos partir para perguntas e respostas. A gente tem a regra que obriga um estudante que comece a puxar a fila. E depois temos vários colegas aqui, professores, que podem também... Já temos? Ótimo. Então, por favor, seu nome. E aqui é o microfone. Usa o meu para a gente não ficar mexendo do Anthony. E esses microfones aqui, às vezes, são rebeldes.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Professor. My name is Maria. I'm a doctorate candidate here. I too study populism overall on a comparative basis, so I was very interested in your conference. I don't mean to throw you under the bus or anything, but I do want to provoke you on a few points. Okay, so I'm gonna start by. I listed some of the points you said about what would be the real characterization of populism. So unmediated contact between leader and masses, anti-globalism, ethnical, religious nationalism, Gnostic in the production of knowledge, rejected lights, charismatic leader. And you also said that the butterfly is changing. So the difficulty of pinning of all of those things. So I really want to ask you, because we know there are multiple approaches to populism, I do want to ask you if this approach finds some limitations in explaining precisely the differences and not the coincidence between all of those cases. I say that because I do have the impression that this debate is fundamentally it is given by the American experience, so, especially Trump and Trumpism, and that might obliterate some cases, particularly in Latin America, considering that these cases, this approach always considers these cases under the light of maybe American, European experience. And in my research, I was particularly interested in the differences between the cases, where I found out that, for instance, Bolsonaro has a very late adherence to the anti-globalist speech. So it was something that he acquired very late in his career, in the last few years. Anti-communism doesn't have such an important place in France in regards with Brazil. Here, that is really big. We can find in France, for instance, the workers organized by an extreme right-wing party. And finally, what I think is very important is that in our local experience, racism and xenophobia, it has very different relationships between those two, and colonialism plays a huge part in that history. So when we go for more substantiated definitions of populism, maybe we can obliterate all of these nuances, and historical particularities of Latin American cases when we we depart from a very European, American-centered point of view. Was I clear? Mm-hmm. Oh, I was so nervous. Thank you so much.
Obrigado, foi ótimo. Como foi uma pergunta mais longa, eu vou, e você anotou bastante, eu vou deixar você responder primeiro, depois nós coletamos outras, pode ser?
Ok. Sim.
Pode, Gabriela, pode. Por favor, vem aqui. Tem.
I guess it's a related question, but more historical. You mentioned like literature earlier, like decades dealing with populism was looking at Latin American or global South experiences of populism and how that affected our democracy. And I guess it was also somehow a way to think of populism as a problem in our democracy, and if we developed enough, we would get rid of populism, right? And then we'll be like a developed democracy and all of it. What happens now is that we're dealing with populism throughout the globe to a point that populism became theoretically and practically a threat for all democracies, and authors dealing with populism accept that populism is a threat to developed democracies like global North democracies too. So I was wondering if you see an effect of what we're seeing now from this kind of backlash from the south to the north. So in a way, to put it shortly, we saw an impact from the north to the south in exporting democracy, and then or civilized democracy or whatever people want to call it, which is colonization in a way. But now we're seeing that these forms of populism that were directly related to our experiences are being experienced in the global north too. So how do you see that as affecting the way we theorize populism and how it appears?
Bom, eu mudei a regra e mudaram a regra. Então, alguém quer pegar carona nessa sequência? A gente faz as famosas 3 primeiras. Se não, a gente passa para o Anthony. Passamos então para o Anthony.
Thank you for the comments. They're tough ones. So, sorry, what was your name? The second question? Gabriela. Okay. So, Maria, there is a tendency in the literature to generalize from the European and American cases. This was something I confronted at the New School when I was there in the 90s, was that often, and the New School was a very kind of Eurocentric institution, and so the European experience was considered universal, and everything else was considered, it had to be related to that somehow. And nothing else was considered universal. And with the States, you can often get that same assumption. So I hope that when people read the book, they won't think that I'm doing that. I mean, I did. That's why I mentioned Cecilia Lero's chapter, because it's very much saying that she's not convinced by either the economic arguments or the cultural arguments of people like Pippa Norris or people like Danny Roderick about. She doesn't think those explanations exactly work from the North American and European cases. She thinks they don't apply in this strictly sense speaking to Philippines or Brazil. So I hope we can have a dialogue where, the theories that we're finding relevant are based on the experiences of countries that aren't just the countries of Europe and the United States. Although it is true that the explosion of work on populism has something to do with the Brexit referendum and the Trump election in 2016. That's not the only reason there's been a lot of work on it, but that's one of the reasons. So I agree with you that, overgeneralizing and stuffing everything into an overly broad category and not appreciating differences is a danger in the work. And I appreciate what you were saying about some of the differences. One of the things that struck me about the comparisons between Trump and Bolsonaro too, or how they missed the different roles of rural urban. So if you go to survey data in the U.S., living in a rural area is strongly correlated with supporting Trump, and that's not the case in Brazil, right? That's a very different. Yeah, you don't it's more of an urban phenomenon. And so there's certain generalizations. One of the questions that one of the surveys uncovered was, again, correlated with support for Trump, was this country a better country in the 1950s? And, you know, there's a strong correlation between people who, in the United States, who say yes, it was, to voting for Trump. And if you think about what happened after the 50s, it makes sense, right? The women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement. I don't think that would resonate in Brazil, right? If you ask people, is the country better than 1950s? I don't know. Are there some Kubitschek nostalgia people around? So maybe the 60s, yeah, before the coup, maybe. So I agree with you that it has limitations. I do think that uncoupling populism as a style, as a performance, from its ideological content is analytically very useful. Because what it does then is that by not defining it in terms of ideological content, you can make some distinctions and you can show differences that you otherwise wouldn't be able to show. Right? So if you say that, you know, right-wing populism is the ideology, that's inevitably going to distort what it's really all about in particular countries, because who the people are and who the anti-people are is going to be very different depending on what the historical experience of that place is. And, you know, this point is made in the literature. So I hope that you'll keep an open mind. If I haven't convinced you with this response, but if you do get a hold of the book, and I don't really care whether you buy it or not, because, you know, if you steal it, that's fine as well. I'm not going to make a lot of money from it, right? So if you go to a Russian black site and you download it for free, it's not really going to, you know, not going to matter to me. But if you read it, I hope you will see that it's not all global north to global south. We're trying to derive experiences and theorize on the basis of more than those experiences that you mentioned. With Gabriella's point, I think you touched on something very interesting, which was the existence of populism was seen, especially by North American political scientists, as a sort of deviation from an ideal type of democracy. And for a long time, North American political scientists were very confident in arguing that the U.S. system was the ideal. So you have a two-party system. You know, you don't have to call them Democrats and Republicans. They could call it something else. But you have a two-party system. They converge around the median voter. Mm-hmm. You know, you have civic. What did Verba and I called it? I think civic culture. Right? Civic culture, which is kind of, you know, the idealization of the North American system. I think that's really died, you know, and you made that point that since what's happened in the United States has been there have been so much polarization and so much dysfunction. You know, even kind of euphemistic American political scientists are not saying that anymore. That this is something that should be emulated. I think if you look at Federico Finkelstein's book about From Fascism to Populism, what he says about the mid-20th century populists, he's actually very nuanced about them. He said that, you know, they're including people. You know, so he takes Peronism, for example, as a paradigmatic case, and he says, you know, the size of the electorate goes up. The participation of women in politics goes up with Peronism. You're getting recognition of citizenship. You're getting inclusion. There's lots of good things about Peronism, right? In terms of democratic quality. But you're also getting a leader who treats the opposition as enemies of the people, right? So it's not fully compatible with liberal democracy. But what he says is interesting, too. He says that the enemies of the people are not necessarily branded as permanent enemies of the people. They can decide to vote for Peronism, and they're kind of accepted. You know, they can kind of blend into the woodwork. It's not fascistic in that sense. So he makes a very important point of saying that the mid-20th century Latin American populism in general is not fascistic. It can evolve into something else, and it is including newly urbanized rural workers who come to the city, who are incorporated politically in very interesting ways, and then you have middle-class representation as well. And so it's really hard. So the whole normative issue with populism is really tricky. and I feel this especially because I'm always arguing with my kids about politics, and for them, the populist critique of the establishment, it resonates, right? And it has legitimacy. I mean, when you talk about liberal, old, stale, conventional liberal democracies being corrupt, being run by insiders for the benefit of insiders, with a self-interested corporate media, a lot of there's a lot of truth there. I listened to Steve Bannon's the first 15 minutes of his speech at the Oxford Union, where he talked about the financial crisis and how the younger generation was getting screwed and there was no accountability and U.S. militarism was running rampant. I said, this guy's great. This is fantastic. This is a great diagnosis. And then he started talking about his solutions. And I thought, oh, God, this guy's not great. Get him out of here. No, I wanted him to speak. But I mean, so I think this is one of the normative problems. So I don't think I'm really answering your question, but I think the condescension of the global north in terms of the deviations of Latin American democracies from this ideal type, that's probably gone because all of the problems that were alleged to be exclusively in the global south are now there. We see them now in these global north democracies. But I think in a way that makes the present moment more interesting because we're in the same boat, right? I don't know who can be complacent about their democracy. I don't think there's anybody can be complacent about their democracy now, And it's like during the pandemic. You hold up a country as an example. Oh, look how they're dealing with the pandemic. It's fantastic. They know exactly what to do. They have high levels of trust. They're responding. And then a few months later, they've got an incredible spike in COVID deaths, and they're completely mishandling it. So I think democracy is a bit like that. It's very hard to say that there's an unalloyed example of a country dealing with this kind of right-wing populism. And I think, those of us who want to counteract it somehow, we have to take the critique coming from right-wing populism seriously and address it and not be dismissive, not be condescending, engage with the realities, and that's an analytical task as well as a political task. I hope I came close to. Yeah, thank you.
Obrigado, Anthony. Mais perguntas? Podem ser em português também, conforme a gente anunciou. É confortável para o Anthony. Pode vir. E depois aqui, quem apareceu? Eu vi mãozinhas? Não?
Tudo bem, meu nome é Guilherme, obrigado pela apresentação. Eu tenho duas dúvidas. Uma em particular é tentar entender um pouco melhor o conceito de populismo abordado por você, porque eu fico pensando muito que ele tem uma intersecção com o conceito de Eco, do Humberto Eco, sobre o urfascismo, por exemplo. Como distinguir se um fascismo, por exemplo, é um subtipo de populismo, se o fascismo é um fenômeno histórico que tem que ser fechado lá e o populismo é um fenômeno recente, como diferenciar os dois? E minha segunda dúvida é poder comentar um pouco sobre a estreia internacional nacionalista, que é meio que esses líderes parecem criar entre eles. A relação entre eles costuma existir, as conexões que líderes supostamente querem tanto levantar rivalidade entre nações costumam se dar muito bem entre eles. E, em particular, estranho caso do Bolsonaro aqui no Brasil, que grudou muito no Trump de uma maneira que eu não vi isso acontecer com o Modi, por exemplo, ou com outros líderes que foram capazes de reconhecer o Biden mais rápido. Um pouco essa distinção do porquê que o Bolsonaro foi tão apegado a um líder em particular no cenário internacional. Obrigado.
E aí, pegando carona, Anthony, no seu texto, no texto que a gente circulou, você menciona o caráter transnacional do populismo de direita, né? Talvez pegando carona na segunda parte da pergunta dele, se você puder falar um pouquinho sobre essa dimensão transnacional. Aqui. Temos Paulo e Edu. O coordenador tem preferência.
Isso é o Rogério, né, que está falando. Anthony, duas questões assim. A primeira volta sempre, né, quando se fala de populismo, que é o conceito, né? Acho que ficou um pouco claro para mim que você tem uma preferência, digamos assim, para pensar o populismo como estilo, né? Então, lá vai uma provocação. Você acha importante esse debate que tem no fundo na literatura, se é estilo, se é ideologia, se é estratégia, né? Enfim, a provocação não pode ser as três coisas ao mesmo tempo, por exemplo, né? Eu sou partidário da ideologia, digamos assim, né? Porque, pensando bem, o discurso divide. E a divisão provoca, a primeira coisa evidente, a polarização na sociedade. E a polarização se baseia em conceitos, né, em fraturas importantes, penso sobretudo no caso europeu, que no longo prazo se mantêm constantes, né, como a divisão imigração, nós, espanhóis, italianos, etc., etc., versus os outros, né. E acho que empobrece muito pensar o populismo apenas em termos de estilo, de performance, né, de estratégia, sem pensar na própria questão ideológica, né. Então, queria te ouvir a respeito disso. A segunda questão se fala muito no populismo, sobretudo em líderes populistas, na América Latina, enquanto na Europa se fala muito de partidos populistas. E, sobretudo, no papel que eles têm para ameaçar o sistema, então a própria democracia. Recentemente, uns 10 anos para cá, tem um debate bastante grande sobre os populistas no poder, né? Quando eles estão no governo, sobretudo vários trabalhos na Europa mostram que o populista, enfim, bate a cabeça na parede, né? Ele pode ficar no poder, pode perder, voltar, mas não consegue pautar o que ele tinha prometido, né? Então, isso, pelo menos no caso da Europa, que é fácil de se pensar, porque se trata de governos de coalizão, né, onde, portanto, o populista dificilmente alcança a maioria para governar sozinho, né? E, mesmo assim, em alguns casos, mostram claramente que não há uma ameaça à democracia, às regras democráticas. Então, até que ponto o autoritarismo está implícito no populismo? Sobretudo se pensar no caso europeu frente a outros casos latino-americanos e asiáticos, se quiser colocar o próprio Trump também. Difícil, não?
Posso só pegar uma carona na provocação? Tem na mesma linha. Posso?
Claro, passa em frente do Edu.
Não, se você é a mesma coisa, né?
Vamos juntar várias.
Vamos.
Tá bom. Então, essa é uma nova regra. Então, só uma pergunta bem localizada na coisa dos anti, que você falou do index do livro. Eu acho que tem uma dimensão que eu não entendi direito. Eu não entendi direito qual é o lugar desses anti na sua definição, no final das contas, né? Como você descobriu no final essa dimensão, né? E eu queria aproveitar para chamar a atenção para uma coisa que eu acho que não está presente, mas que me parece importante nessa virada recente, tanto de direita quanto de esquerda, que é um caráter revanchista, em que sempre tem essa ideologia, do seu ponto de vista, a estratégia política e, portanto, o estilo, sempre tem a ideia de que alguma coisa foi tirada de nós, né? E aí a construção do outro, que é a segunda parte do seu argumento, né, no campo da ideologia, é o outro que usurpou do seu poder dentro da democracia e tomou alguma coisa da gente, né? E aí o outro varia de um lugar para o outro, mas é sempre um outro e, portanto, tem uma dimensão de revanche que está presente. E talvez por isso é que apareça tanto anti. Por isso o anti seja uma dimensão importante para definir.
Obrigado, Eduardo.
Obrigado, Edu. Professora Marta, quer engatar aqui?
Então, pegar carona nas provocações. São diversos trabalhos que reafirmam essa ideia de que o conceito de populismo é um conceito ambíguo, um conceito... E você mesmo relatou essa história no projeto, né? Eu queria tratar do populismo, mas eu acabei tratando mesmo da extrema direita, né? Tem um debate que diz, bom, mas o trabalho do Miguel Lago, né? Enfim, Lula e Bolsonaro ambos são bolsonaristas, o que eles desferem. Então, a minha provocação é assim: A gente precisa mesmo da categoria populismo para analisar o que está acontecendo na América Latina, né? E se a grande questão é o populismo ou a perplexidade de que a extrema-direita seja popular. Então, o problema é, de fato, o populismo, ou a grande questão a ser interpretada é a existência do populismo, ou a perplexidade de que movimentos antidemocráticos e anti-igualitários e mesmo antissistema sejam populares. Você tem líderes que sejam populistas ou não, ou que sejam, mas eles são populares a despeito de terem uma agenda ou um programa que, digamos assim, encontraria todas as nossas expectativas do que seria digamos assim, uma evolução linear da civilização. Então, a minha provocação é: o que é relevante é o populismo dos líderes de extrema-direita ou a popularidade dos líderes de extrema-direita na América Latina e no mundo, né?
Acho que já temos bastante, né?
Sim. Should I start? Okay. Guilherme, I think, and I know this from doing the index, there's one mention of fascism in the book. It's referred to in passing. And I guess I chickened out. I didn't engage with that. It's a major theme of Finkelstein's book. I didn't engage with it because I thought it would require another book or another series of considerations. But I think it is a big debate in the literature to what extent right-wing, the extreme right, is evoking fascism or has similarities with fascism, and I think there's a relevant debate. But I didn't really want to get into it. And I guess at the time of the 2018 election, I remember being asked at the BBC Brazil, like, is this a fascist movement? And I said, well, I have this very old-fashioned traditional notion of fascism, which that it has to involve, mobilization on the streets, wear the black shirts, wear the fascisti, of Mussolini and Hitler. And I don't see that. And so, you have a social media sort of version of it, but I didn't think that was fascism. So, but I think that could be another avenue of research, is to kind of take up where Finkelstein leaves off and pursue that. On nationalism, I think Yasha Monk has an interesting quote about nationalism where he says it's a very important element in democracy. It can be a kind of agglutinative constituent of democracy because it creates a common identity and it helps solidify an understanding in democracy of who citizens are. But it's an animal that's best domesticated. If you let it out of the cage and you let certain versions of nationalism go rampant, you start getting anti-democratic elements to it. And I don't fully understand why Bolsonaro had such a automatic link to Trump administration. I remember when did it happen? When John Bolton, the national security advisor to Trump, came down to Rio, and I think it was Eduardo Bolsonaro saluted him, and I just thought, what is that all about? And maybe this is a question for empirical research, that the transnational links between the far right in the United States and the far right in Brazil hasn't really been uncovered yet. We don't know enough about those links, and they've got to be extensive. I'd imagine there's more information will come out about common sources of funding, common sources of ideological inspiration. We saw that when the dinner in Washington happened in March of 2019, when the entourage of Bolsonaro went to Washington and had dinner with Olavo de Carvalho and Steve Bannon. And it was, I was unfortunately reading the work of the foreign minister at the time as well, and just thinking, where is this guy getting these ideas? Trump, the savior of the Western world, and so on. So I think that probably we have to do more work on that. with Rogerio's question about transnationalism, this is one of the things I think is so paradoxical about this right-wing movement. It's so kind of Westphalian in its notion of what the nation should be, right? It's, you read this in Ernesto Araujo's work. The European Union is threatening God, the nation, and the family because it's, they're sort of converging on certain policies. But it itself is an incredibly transnational movement, and this is one of the chapters in the book looks at Twitter. They did a really great research. This is two researchers from USP, who looked at tweets that were retweeted over 100 times in 2020, for a 6-month period in 2020, that mentioned the word globalismo or globalism. And the language, sorry? What chapter? It's a chapter by, it's a chapter in the 3rd section of the book, called, I can't remember the title of it, but it's basically pointing out that by comparing these tweets that were sent from Spain, people based in Spain and Italy and Brazil in this same period. Italy too, yeah. That there's an incredible convergence of language about globalism. So it really is, and they show, through this data that it is very, very transnational. There's incredible convergence, and I think even some of the talking points. I remember early on in the Bolsonaro administration, there were talking points about the need for homeschooling. It was important to do homeschooling. And you thought, where the hell is this coming from, right? It's got to be coming from talking points from the far right in the United States, because it's not really a movement in Brazil, right? Who the hell cares about homeschooling in Brazil? I don't know. I've never heard of anyone tell me about it. And then I remember in the protest on January 8th, there was some sign that said, show us the source code, which is apparently a slogan that was used in the January 6th attacks in 2021. So I think that's a great area to research, is the transnational convergence, and we don't know enough about it. Let's see. I've got Guilherme and Rogério. I think Paulo, you were next, right? I can sympathize. I understand why you prefer a definition of populism that combines the ideological, the stylistic, and the organizational. And there's some authors in the book who try that. There's some authors who try to synthesize that. I'm not saying so my approach is not to say that ideology is not important. I think it's very important, but I'm trying to analytically separate it from the populist style, to point out that populist style can be combined with all kinds of different ideologies. That in that sense, I agree with Laclau, although I'm not a Laclauian. That in some ways it's an empty signifier, in that you can put a lot of different things in it, and you see this in the evolution of certain careers. So Giorgia Meloni, for example, has moderated her position once she got elected prime minister. So if you read Kurt Wayland, for example, he argues that given the sort of coalitional parliamentarism in many of the European countries, it's very hard for right-wing populists to execute in power what they promise in the campaigns, because there are these moderating influences. I'm not. He says, the conditions don't exist for populists, right-wing populists, to destroy democracy in Europe. I'm not so convinced, because I'm looking at Poland and I'm looking at Hungary and thinking maybe that's a little bit too complacent. But I can understand why you'd want to retain those other aspects of the definition. And I think, okay, so you're saying to what degree is authoritarianism central to populism? I do think that the insistence of many right-wing populists that they embody the will of the people is inherently authoritarian. And it reminds me of the divine right of kings that was prevalent in Europe. So even constitutional monarchies, I remember I did some research in the archive in Windsor Castle in last summer, and the idea in the constitutional monarchy in Britain in the early 19th century was that the king, the body of the king, represented sovereignty. Physically, he was the sovereign, and nothing could function. The House of Commons, representation, decision-making, nothing could function without the king being physically there to bless it. And in a way, that there's vestiges of that. We just saw the coronation, right? There's vestiges of that in the British system. A lot of right-wing authoritarian populists have that idea about themselves. So Trump, in his inaugural address in 2017, which is probably the worst inaugural address I've ever heard, it was written by Steve Bannon, right? He says, "Only I can fix it." Right? He gives this apocalyptic vision of the United States, crime and drugs and devastation and everything is terrible. Only I can fix it. That's inherently authoritarian, right? It's power is channeled and centralized through me as a person, and I'm going to do all these things. And so I think in that sense, the anti-pluralism of many right-wing populists is if it's not realized in many instances, as you say, they can't realize. In fact, this is something that Bob Barr, Trump's former Attorney General, was saying the other day. He's saying if you vote for Trump thinking that he's going to give you the platform that he's running on, he can't, because it's all just chaos. It's just fire and fury. He's completely chaotic. And in the end, what Trump is about is, he's a clown that's interested in his own wealth, his own celebrity, his own power, but he's not going to deliver anything. This is why I think DeSantism is more dangerous, because DeSantis knows how to deliver stuff, right? He went to law school. He can read a bill and understand what it's going to do. And he has a machine. Eduardo, on the antis, I guess, so what I was trying to say with the antis, that they help fill that empty signifier. So if we analytically distinguish the populist style from the ideology, in the case of right-wing populism, but not all populisms, those antis seem to be very important. And I liked what you said, that the revanchista element is there. Somebody took something from us. This was very prevalent in the Leave campaign in the UK in 2016. They took this from us. We used to have a culture that we knew, we understood, and we liked, and we felt comfortable in. We used to have, sovereignty over our economic decisions, and they took that away from us, and it's all been taken by the bureaucrats in Brussels. And we have to take back control. And that was a very powerful argument, because the Remain campaign was saying, well, look, all these economists say that, we'll have a higher GDP if we stay in the European Union. And they were right. But what people were angry about was this idea that they didn't have control. And in fact, there's interesting research that shows the Leave vote wasn't correlated with places that had high levels of immigrants. It was correlated with places that had major increases in the number of immigrants. So London, which is 40% of the population was born overseas, voted 60% to remain, because people were happy living in, multinational communities. But in places like Lincoln, or Norfolk, where there's a perception that immigration had increased drastically in the last 10 years, people were freaked out. So I think the revanchista argument is really interesting. And Trump is the same, make America great again. So it was great before at some time. And you lost it because you couldn't secure the border, because the culture changed too much, because, manufacturing jobs were sent abroad. Marta, I really liked your question, and I was very conscious of this when I started this project. There are plenty of very good analysts of what's going on politically who don't use populism. Thomas Frank is an American journalist who I like a lot, and he says this populism stuff, I don't like it, I don't use it. It's totally mischaracterizes what American populism was in the 19th century. He's very positive about it. Fine. Piketty, Thomas Piketty, someone who says, look, populism is a word that people use to disqualify other people who suggest things like progressive taxation on wealth, So I'm just not going to use it. But when you actually read between the lines of his latest book, Capitalism and Ideology, he is worried about what other people are calling populism. So although he doesn't use the word, and I respect him for not using the word, because it is abused, right? It is abused in the media. I think he can't avoid, because he says somewhere in the book, right at the beginning of the book, if we don't deal with inequality, right, and he talks about the elephant curve, the famous elephant curve that shows the gains from globalization from 1980 to 2020 or so, and you see the gains amongst the poor, you see the fantastic gains in the wealthy, and then you see this squeezed middle, right? And people say, okay, that's one of the reasons why we have these political movements. But he says, unless we start dealing with inequality and start looking at our tax regime, our property regime, our education, our health systems, these are all choices we can make. Unless we deal with that, we're going to be, inundated by right-wing populism. He kind of says that. I mean, I can't remember if he uses the word populism, but that's what he's worried about. So I absolutely respect not using it. And the thing is, you're saying, how are they? I have a confession to make to get to this question that you're asking. Is it that they're populist, or is it the right wing is popular? And I think it's hard to separate those issues. So the confession I have is that I bought a book supposedly written by Eduardo Bolsonaro. I'm sorry, I just had to do it. And the co-author is the head of communications, was the head of communications for the Bolsonaro government. And what's amazing in there, because you look at the survey data, and a lot of wealthy people, a lot of well-educated people voted for Bolsonaro, right? This is not, same with the Brexit referendum. This wasn't a cry from below and just, all about just poor people doing these things. But the way they present themselves in the book, the preface to the book by this communications director, is so full of resentment. So he says things like, you see people on TV who are, Morecinos or, pampered kids of the upper middle class who don't know what the hell they're doing, and they've been sustained by their parents for all this time, and they go to places like USP and they spout on about politics. It's full of this resentment. These chattering classes, these elites, these overprivileged, overeducated people are trying to tell you what to do and what to think about Bolsonaro, and we're going to tell you the truth about how this guy came from nothing and worked hard and represented the real values of Brazil. And what you see is the theme throughout is victimization. We're victimized. We're victimized. And I think that's one of the things that populist leaders are able to kind of magically pull off. They're both victims and strong leaders. So Modi's like this, right? The people in New Delhi, they're elites. The Gandhi family, the Nehru family, they're all privileged. They're trying to tell me, a humble person of the soil, what to do, a lower caste person what to do, but I defy them, and I'm going to be strong, and I'm going to defy them. I'm going to fight this victimization, whereas you maybe you can't because you're downtrodden and so on. So they're both simultaneously, victimized, beat up by the establishment, but they're going to defend and strike back. And I think. And so I read part of this book. I couldn't stand it for very long. I read a few pages, but the Bolsonaro book, shows that maybe this is one of the reasons why the hard right is popular, because it's appealing to this sense that we've lost something, right? We've been victimized. Somebody should pay for this. There's got to be someone to blame for this because it's not my fault, and their very easy identification of targets resonates emotionally. And I think this is why, a lot of the voters for the Leave campaign in Britain are so bewildered, is because they had this great, simple solution, and it was just to untangle oneself from the EU, and everything would be better. And everything's more complicated. It's worse than it was before. And half the trade still goes to the European Union. It's a lot more complicated. Did I do all the questions? Marta, were you the last one? So I think, just to summarize, I think you can address the issues politically without using populism, but because there's been so much commentary about it, it's because conceptually it's kind of entered the mainstream, it's very hard to avoid it altogether, I would say. But you're probably right that the really important question is, why are these movements popular? And I think populism, in a way, is partly an answer to that question. That the fact that Trump, for example, is kind of the poor person's fantasy of what they would do if they were rich, right? They would have all the gold bling, they would live in a big mansion, they would drive around in big cars, and then they would eat the kind of food that he likes to eat. That seems great to a lot of people, right? And then the Republican chattering classes who are horrified by him, they're completely sidelined because that's something that makes him popular, But yeah.
Terminamos? Acho que sim. Muito bom, muito bom. Bom, Anthony, muito obrigado pelo seu fôlego hoje, que começou bem cedo e se manteve até aqui conosco. Essa brilhante apresentação e todo o debate que se travou em torno dessas perguntas, que eu acho que o livro já está pronto, mas como você disse no final do seu artigo, que o conflito sobre o destino do populismo de direita no Brasil e no mundo não vai acabar logo, então acho que teremos assunto para te rever aqui em breve, e assim esperamos. E se a situação na Flórida se agravar a ponto de seu governador tornar a sua vida inviável por lá, saiba que você é muito bem-vindo nesta casa, que vai saber te acolher, se for preciso. Tá bom? Então, muito obrigado mais uma vez e obrigado a todos. Na próxima semana, convido para o seminário que vai discutir as pesquisas eleitorais no Brasil com representantes dos institutos de pesquisa, tá bom? Estão todos convidados.